Welcome, everybody, to Huddle Up with Matias Bueno, episode 31. Today's guest is CFL on TSN analyst and draft analyst of the CFL, Duane Forde. Duane, thanks so much for joining today's episode. I'm super excited to talk CFL football with you.
It's my pleasure. It's been too long, I think, for a lot of us since we've talked Canadian football.
So we've seen a lot of stuff in the news recently about some of the free agent signings that have been made and a lot of the issues that may come up with the salary and a lot of GMs reaching for the floor, maybe instead of the ceiling. You saw Zach Evans just recently got released with a bit of a contract issue in terms of money. But how do you think that free agency will affect the prospects who are hoping to be taken in 2021? Because with having had no season for some players, it's going to be really difficult for them to show their stuff.
Yeah, it is. And I think the biggest issue is not so much with established free agents that are already in the league, but the challenge that you're going to see in the CFL is essentially having two rookie classes, two draft classes coming into the league at the same time. So this is what's led to some of the rules for the 2021 draft, primarily the number of rounds being reduced so that there are a couple less players in this 2021 draft class. Guys having the option to opt out of the draft based on really nobody using any intercollegiate eligibility, whether you're talking about guys in the NCAA or guys playing youth sports football right now. But just trying to manage those numbers in terms of, the number of rookies, Canadian rookies in particular, coming in at the same time and competing for the same job. So I don't think that free agency will impact it nearly as much as just the double cohort in terms of the draft.
And from conversations I've had with some youth sports coaches, they've talked about dealing with that issue at the same level within their programs. Coach Dobie had told me about, okay, now we got guys for 2020 and 2021 coming in at the same time. So how do you make sure that there's a limit, right? Because obviously with CFL teams, you can bring in lots more players to training camp and you cut guys. But in youth sports, you're not really looking to make that big of a splash in terms of bringing 100 plus guys into a roster, maybe with a few exceptions in the OUA or other conferences that are a lot more rigorous in terms of their competitive selection process. But how much of an issue do you think this may affect youth sports programs for the 2021 season?
Well, I think it's something that's going to be fascinating to watch, not just in the 2021 season, but really for about the next 4, maybe even 5 years, because of the way that this logjam has been created. And again, the same thing applies to the CFL, that as much as it would be nice to think that sort of, when the pandemic gets under control and things like that, and the rules go back to normal, that everything's going to go back to normal. But it's not necessarily the case, because what you're going to have is all of these guys who have, for all intents and purposes, an extra year of eligibility. It's going to create a backlog, right? So that guys who are coming back for their 5th year, that assuming a certain number of those guys are going to remain and still play their 5th year now in 2021 instead of 2020. That's going to cause, on the other end, as you alluded to, it's going to cause guys coming in to redshirt. Well, now those guys, when they get to years, basically year 4, you usually anticipate some of your top recruits moving on via the draft after their 4th year. Well, a lot of those guys will still have eligibility left. And so you're going to have some of those guys now sticking around. And so basically until all of the guys that are in the system with this extra year of eligibility, for lack of a better way to explain it, as long as those guys are in the system for the next 4 or 5 years, you're going to see an impact on the guys coming in. So it's going to be a really interesting time, I think, for the next few recruiting classes.
And I thought that it was a really interesting issue that had been brought up, because the obvious sentiment would be, okay, they can't control a global health crisis, so we're going to give them the next year. And initially they said no, and then everyone had backlash. Everyone, lashed out and said, no, we're going to take it to court and all these things. And then they said, okay, fine. But I still had questions in my mind related to what that would mean, like you mentioned, for the guys who were not going to go into their 5th year, but their 4th year, because those guys don't get the extra year when they're 25. They still get a year older. So there's going to be, you're right, a backlog of players that don't get the benefit of the extra year, but have to kind of play catch up. And assumingly so, they have to compress maybe the abilities that they were looking to gain over 2 years into one in order for them to have relatively similar draft stock. So in terms of how this now affects the quality of the 2021 draft class, Do you think that they won't stand as much of a chance against the guys from 2020 who at least had the opportunity to play college before being selected?
I don't think there's necessarily as much of that. You know, I think that all of these guys, when you look at the guys that would be in this 2021 draft class, typically, yeah, you have guys that have played a reasonable amount for 2, in some cases, maybe even 3 years. And you hope that guys are doing things to improve themselves during this year off. Yeah, it is a factor when you consider that, especially in youth sports football, a season really isn't that long. It's not really that many games. And so to lose 1 year is a significant amount of game experience. But you hope that kind of with the time off that people are able to find ways to adapt and make up for that. I mean, even I go back to the 2020 draft, and it was very different for scouts, very different for prospects because of the lack of combines. And so everybody had to adapt and find ways. Guys had to find different ways to train, had to find different ways to showcase their talents, their abilities, different ways for them to be evaluated. And also scouts had to find different ways to evaluate them. And so I hope that players in the 2021 class in particular are kind of using this time to find different ways to make themselves better players, whether it means putting in a little more time on the mental side of the game in the film room and so on. Maybe it means, because you're talking about smaller groups and so on, in terms of any kind of practice session that you may have, it may be really refining your technique, working with your position coach and things like that to try and refine those things to try to make up for that lost game experience.
And even just at the bare bones, forget about the global pandemic, but when you think about preparing for the draft in general, it's a bit of a daunting task in terms of what pressure it brings to the outlook of your professional career. Guys who are trying to line up graduating from a program at university while they don't limit their football opportunities. If you reflect back on your experiences having graduated from University of Western Ontario and being taken in the first round, 6th overall by the Stamps in 1991, what were some of the things that you had to deal with in terms of the pressure of being drafted, but while also trying to balance your academics and making sure that you were able to succeed in all facets?
Yeah, and I would say it was a little bit of a different time then, because it was almost like not as much emphasis was put on the combine in a lot of ways. And not to say that you didn't train hard for it and things like that, but I think that guys now are much more committed, much more aware of things like training year round. For example, back then we didn't necessarily lift a lot during the season to sort of maintain strength. So it was almost like the combine came up early in the off season and you weren't necessarily in your best shape. And so I think guys are a lot more aware of something like that now. Guys do a lot more specific training for the combine, and will go out and work with trainers and things like that. Strength and conditioning coaches weren't part of the equation at Canadian universities at that time either. And so, I would say that maybe we were living in the dark a little bit more in terms of some of that, where yes, we were training and preparing, but it wasn't necessarily the same time commitment or same awareness, I would say, that guys have now in terms of having to get ready. But it is a pressure, finding a balance, making sure that, especially if you're really talking about stepping up your training to get ready for the combine, that it is going to be an additional time commitment to what your strength and conditioning commitments would be otherwise during the off season of a youth sports year, of a Canadian university calendar year. So it's tough for those guys for sure. But I know guys, as I said, last year, guys did a very good job of kind of finding ways to work around it. And I'm sure this 2021 class will benefit from some of the things that they saw last year and come up with some of their own innovations as well.
And the time off that guys get from being in football and being in that environment, it slows everything down. While many people have had their lives slowed down as a result of what's happened this year, from having talked with guys who played last year but then didn't get to play this year, it almost seems like there is an opportunity in terms of mental preparation or physical preparation, because now you get the opportunity and the time to be able to kind of take some risks, maybe not do something obviously belligerent, but you get to really experiment with trying to understand your psyche more. And what do you think some of the elements will be that players can now take advantage of with not having to worry about being banged up towards the end of the year and being able to really manage their load in terms of working out, mental training, and just being able to relax and be out of football.
Yeah, I think the level of consistency that it provides for training, as you said, guys aren't dealing with injuries at the end of the year. You know, usually you may take a couple weeks off at the end of the season to try to recover. I think that's kind of a double-edged sword, because I think that on one hand, guys will be able to sort of work through. They don't necessarily need the same break, but you also want to be aware that usually in a training year, you're gonna kind of cycle your training depending on what stage of the year it is, what stage of your preparation, and so on. And so you want to make sure that guys aren't overdoing it as well, because there has been no season to kind of signal, okay, here's the time to cut back a little bit on the lifting or cut back a little bit on the speed work. That you want to make sure that guys are still taking the appropriate time to recover and still kind of having those points in their cycle where the volume of training is a little higher and on the other side of it, a little bit lower.
And it is interesting that there is an advantage to this, but obviously with not playing football or not really being in that scenario where you're getting game experience, that is a drawback. So when you reflect on your playing experience, did you find that there was a lot of challenges and obstacles you had to overcome mentally related to balancing your school and balancing thinking about the draft? Because like you mentioned, it wasn't maybe as intense in terms of year-round training, and obviously the game has evolved since, but what did you have to explore? What did you go through in terms of looking for an opportunity to be drafted versus trying to figure out what your life would look like if you weren't? Because it's not like the NFL where if you make it, you can acquire generational wealth, because in the CFL, that's not really the case, even if you're number one overall.
Yeah, and it depends on obviously what guys' other aspirations are outside of football. For me, I wanted to go to teachers college, but I was finishing my degree in 91, but I was in a position where I had a reasonable idea that I was going to be drafted fairly high in that draft, but it's making that decision that, okay, well, I'm not going to bother applying to teachers college this year and basically cover my bases. Yeah, there's the risk that even if I get drafted, that I don't make the team, that I end up going back to school for my fifth year to play the last year of eligibility and so on. And, on one hand, you're thinking about planning your academic future, but at the same time, putting as many eggs in the football basket as you can, I suppose. And so, yeah, that's part of it, is kind of very much planning on two tracks. But mentally, you're trying not to plan for failure. You don't want to think like you're planning for failure, right? You're planning to go and make the team, put yourself in the best position to make the team. So it's kind of like you don't want to put too much thought into plan B.
And I've heard people use a quotation, they hate plan B. And I remember seeing a video of Arnold Schwarzenegger talking about how much he hates plan B because people are scared and they use it as a safety net. So you talk about teachers college, and my older brother is a teacher, as a high school teacher, and he was talking about the enjoyment he gets out of the routine, right? The security that exists within a job like being a school teacher. Whereas in football, it has a structured routine, but it has probably some of the least job security that you can ever have for any profession in the world, basically, because you could be cut the next day for arbitrary reasons and you never know when you can play again. So as you navigated through your CFL career, did you find that it got way easier to kind of temper the waters and make sure that you knew that you didn't have to worry about plan B as much? Or how did you manage those ongoing thoughts? Because obviously, you played for what would be seen as a long amount of time if you played for more than 3 years, which is the average in the league, but you were able to last through a long career. How did you do that in terms of not worrying about plan B, but also understanding as time went on that it was going to become a more realistic thing to worry about?
Yeah, and I would say that particularly as you become more of a veteran player, you're usually aware of your situation, right? So this is something where as a rookie, you kind of go in blind. You don't really know where you stand. You don't know really how good your chances are or aren't of making the team. But I would say as a veteran guy, I know for me, I usually had a level of awareness of where I stood in terms of a spot on the roster, and maybe how prepared I needed to be to do something else. As I said, I mean, obviously, education was always something that was important to me. My father was a high school principal, and so it was kind of a given that we were going to go to university, we were going to be educated and put ourselves in the best possible position to be employed and not be, I wasn't a guy who was going to play football because I had to. I was a guy that was going to play football because I wanted to and had the opportunity to do so. And, I mean, to put it in perspective, I guess for me, when my career essentially ended, I was ready for that. And a story I've told a few times is after my 12th year in the CFL, I had played my last couple of years for Hamilton, and Ron Lancaster was our head coach. And so I got a phone call from Ron. I think it was December, so about a month after the end of the 2002 season, and he was calling to let me know that they weren't going to pick up the option year of my contract. 2003 would have been the option. So essentially saying, we're going to let you go. You're going to be a free agent. We're not renewing your contract. And quite honestly, at the time he called me, I still remember to this day, I was sitting on my bed in my bedroom, and I had 2 stacks of paper, one on either side of me on the bed. And one of them was papers for teachers college applications. And I went to teachers college in the States, and it was starting in January, so a month later. And on the other side of me were a stack of papers to purchase some equipment for a personal training business. I had always worked as a personal trainer in the off season. My degree is in physical education, kinesiology. And so that had always been my off-season job. And I was always interested in kind of the strength and conditioning thing and sport-specific training and working with athletes. And so I was kind of thinking about that. So I kind of realized that at that time that I was at the end. And so that year, more than any other year, I was prepared to move on and do other things.
And in those scenarios, especially as a veteran, with any of the CFL veterans I've talked to, they can kind of tell when the writing's on the wall, and you can kind of get to see, okay, I'm getting towards the end. They want to bring in younger guys. They want to save the contract. So what can I do to position myself so I can pivot to the next profession without having to worry about being left for dead? Because if you talk to, having played 12 years in the CFL, you talk to any of your old teammates who played for as long as you did, one of the things that you'll realize as a trend is that guys usually don't leave on their own terms, and that most guys still believe that there is the ability to play in them. And it's hard to kind of let go of that right away, or to drop it and say, okay, now I'm going to go to teachers college. All good. No worries, Ron. Thanks for letting me know. People are like, no, like I could still play. Or you watch on TV, you're like, man, like, look at that guy blew his assignment. Like I probably could have done that. And I think it is a difficult transition in athletes' careers, like even just outside of football. So did you feel that there was moments that you were able to reach out, or that you saw maybe some of that in your teammates, or you were able to help them with, hey, like it's going to be okay? Or how did you rally around your teammates who are maybe going through a similar experience, or how did you come to terms with the situation that was going to be presented for yourself, with knowing that you had already played over 10 years?
Yeah. And as I said, I mean, for me, I was fortunate, because you definitely do see guys who are kind of trying to hang on, right? And you see it in every sport, really, when players are hanging on past their prime, or some guys maybe change their roles a little bit. You think sometimes of, say, in a sport like hockey, where you see a guy who has been a star player, first line center for most of his career, and then at the end of his career kind of becomes a third or fourth liner, sort of a role player, a little more of a specialist who's there to be a veteran presence. And guys are able to adapt and do different things. For me, one of the things that I honestly felt in terms of why I was ready, I think there may have been opportunities to play another year or play another 2 years, but I didn't want to be something different. And one of the things that I always felt was in year 12, even just the feeling that physically I couldn't do some of the things that I could do in year 10, or couldn't do them as easily as I could have done them in year 10, that for me, that made me ready to go, because I wasn't comfortable performing as less of a player. I wasn't comfortable feeling like I was hanging on. I don't necessarily know a lot of my teammates that sort of really tried to hang on past their prime and, maybe needed to have that conversation. I think that, having played most of my career in Calgary, especially, we were a team that had a lot of continuity. And so a lot of the guys, I would say, had good long careers with a core group of guys, had experienced success. And I think were, for the most part, satisfied with where they were when it was time to move on.
And with having played in Calgary during a time that the franchise really turned its success around, for CFL fans out there like myself who wouldn't be older than 30, before the 90s, the St. Peters were not the indestructible force that they are now or have been in the last 2 decades. And speaking of Calgary during that time, you played on 2 Grey Cup teams that had different quarterbacks that were significant faces in the NFL, with having played it. Doug Flutie, 92, led the team to victory against Winnipeg. And then the nail biter against Hamilton and Winnipeg in 1998 with Jeff Garcia. How crazy was it to be alongside those guys who you knew had NFL experience, and then later on went back to the NFL and still did great things? How did you reflect on that after your career? What was it like going through the moment of, wow, Doug Flutie is my teammate, or Jeff Garcia is my teammate? He went to play in the NFL later on, and he did all the, that just must have been so crazy.
Well, in a lot of ways, you don't really think about it when you're going through it. I mean, Doug was unique because Doug, as a Heisman Trophy winner, was so famous for the Hail Mary when he was at Boston College, and was such a big deal when he came out and signed with the United States Football League for a whack of money. And of course, there were a lot of stories about him and the NFL and his struggle even to kind of get attention from the NFL the first time around, because he was a guy who didn't fit the prototype. And, so because Doug had such a big reputation, was so well known, that with him, where as much as we were all teammates playing on the same team, you felt a little bit like you were part of this celebrity's entourage, basically, when playing with Doug. With Jeff hadn't been to the NFL yet. You know that he was a great CFL quarterback, but he was just your teammate at the time. He didn't necessarily come with the history that Doug did specifically. But I look at the quarterbacks that we had, most particularly in Calgary, and it's amazing to think that you go from Doug Flutie, who is then succeeded by Jeff Garcia. Both those guys move on to the National Football League and become Pro Bowlers. But even when Jeff Garcia was there, the number 2 guy behind Jeff Garcia for most of those years was Dave Dickinson, who is now a Canadian Football Hall of Famer. The number 3 guy on that 98 team was Henry Burris, who's going into the Hall of Fame. And so you kind of think about the quarterback room that we had at the time. Even the next year, 99, when Jeff left to go to San Francisco and Dave took over as the starter, Henry moved up to be the number 2 guy. Partway through the year, Henry got injured. And so we brought in this quarterback. He was a guy who had been a bit of a journeyman in the NFL, hadn't played a lot down there, had bounced around with a number of different organizations. It was Mike McCoy, who just stayed for 1 year and then had an opportunity to get involved in coaching. He had an opportunity to go back to the NFL as a quality control coach, because some people he had been around over the years recognized that this is a guy that has sort of a coach's mind. And Mike, of course, has gone on to become a successful offensive coordinator, was a very good offensive coordinator with Denver for a number of years, spent a little bit of time as the head coach of the Chargers. And so to sort of think of this string of guys and combinations of all of these guys being in the same meeting room at the same time that's the thing that really amazes me.
And how the CFL kind of fosters these connections with guys that go on to have great success. I find that the league can be underrated in that aspect, because people often forget a little bit where some of these coaches came from, or how intelligent they really were. On a previous episode that I recorded with Milt Stiegel, we talked about the 2007 Winnipeg Blue Bombers quarterback locker room, right? You think about who is in that meeting room for the QBs, right? Kevin Glenn, CFL journeyman, the ultimate CFL journeyman. You think about Ryan Dinwiddie, super intelligent minded quarterback, coached Calgary with quarterbacks, now has an opportunity to be a head coach in Toronto. And then Cliff Kingsbury, who now all the youngsters would know because of him leading Kyler Murray and being at Texas Tech, and with now being in the NFL again with Kyler Murray. And then can't forget about the person who was finally called up, Zach Taylor. Now, listen, the Cincinnati Bengals are definitely in a difficult situation, but the fact that even when they had to call up someone from the practice roster, that all four of those guys did something significant in professional football, to me is super amazing and underrated, and spoke to how well coached they were, and also what a great chemistry that created for that locker room. Because when you have, like what Milt said, was when you have guys who are supporting Kevin Glenn, thinking like a coach, and they have that mindset ready, that you're built for success for a while. Now, obviously, Winnipeg went through a lot of turnover in terms of the quarterback position after the departure of Kevin Glenn, but that at least established success that they had from Kahari Jones to Kevin Glenn was an amazing run for Winnipeg. And even with the way you just mentioned with Calgary, Mike McCoy and all these guys, Jeff Garcia, Dave Dickinson. David Dickinson ended up playing quarterback for BC, and now he's a Hall of Famer. He's a great head coach and was succeeded by John Hufnagel. John Hufnagel, I actually never knew this. So, John, if you ever listen to this, pardon me for not knowing before, but John had been in the NFL in the early 2000s. He had coached with the Jaguars. He had coached with the Patriots. Tom Brady early in his years. I was so blown away with knowing this when I found this out like last week.
Yeah, so John Hufnagel, he was the offensive, you mentioned, as the offensive coordinator for yourself. And so what was it like to pick the brain of a guy like him who has had such a deep hand in great players that have played in the NFL and having a lot of coaching experience down there that has really changed the game as we know it?
Yeah, it's amazing to think. And for me, as I said, the experience with John goes back to my rookie year in 1991 in Calgary. He was our offensive coordinator in Calgary for me, 91, 92. And then I had him again as OC in 96 when I went back there after stops in Winnipeg and Toronto. And so, historically, when you look at it, for CFL fans watching the game now, they are so used to the 5 receiver offense as everybody's kind of base offense, 5 receivers, 1 back. Well, traditionally, it always used to be 4 receivers, 2 backs in the backfield, even going back further where one of those 4 receivers was a tight end rather than the 2 slots. But the game continued to open up. And the first team to use the 5 receiver offense was the Calgary Stampeders in the early 1990s. And that was John Hufnagel's brainchild. He was the guy who came up with that concept and developed it. I've always taken it a little bit personally as one of the guys being taken off the field for the extra receiver that he felt he needed to get rid of me for the offense to work a little bit better. But the fact is, John is a brilliant offensive mind, a brilliant football guy, and has impacted the game in so many different ways. You mentioned some of the quarterbacks that he worked with over the course of his time in the National Football League, all guys who had a lot of success during the time that John was there, in addition to the very successful quarterbacks that he worked with in the CFL. But I think when you look, again, like going back a little further and you talk about some of those old Calgary quarterbacks, we talked about Doug Flutie and Jeff Garcia, guys who went on to become Pro Bowl quarterbacks in the National Football League. I truly think that those players who had those CFL roots in Calgary under John Hufnagel, those guys, I think, really changed the mindset of the National Football League, where the NFL used to be a league that was so much about the prototypical, sort of 6'3" and taller pocket passer, that it meant that guys like Doug and Jeff didn't really get looked at when they were coming out of college. They weren't seen as NFL quarterbacks. They didn't fit the mold. And yet, after developing their talents in the Canadian Football League and having a chance to go to the NFL, they proved themselves as dominant quarterbacks. And I think that those guys are a big part of the change in the NFL's mindset. You mentioned Kyler Murray earlier. Kyler Murray is a guy who a generation ago doesn't even get looked at by the National Football League as a quarterback. He's being asked to play wide receiver, being asked to play defensive back because he doesn't fit the quarterback mold. His size and skill set don't fit sort of the cookie cutter that used to exist at the time. But I think because you had guys like Doug and Jeff who were kind of a little more unorthodox, scramblers, maybe a little bit smaller. That the success that those guys had, I think, shifted the mindset, opened the minds of NFL scouts to where you see a guy like Kyler Murray, a guy like Baker Mayfield being number 1 overall picks in the NFL draft when, as I said, a generation ago, they'd have been lucky to even get into a training camp as quarterbacks.
And even someone like Russell Wilson, who
for sure
people have debated pound for pound could be seen as the best player in football. Now, maybe not necessarily because, he's not as talented as Patrick Mahomes is at this moment or the trajectories or what have you, but for putting somebody in his frame at 5'10", 5'11", and for him to have the success that he's had, like the Kyler Murrays, like the Baker Mayfields, is astounding. And that's something that you mentioned. You wouldn't see those guys a generation ago get a shot in the NFL. And it just goes to show how now the game is evolving to open up the passing game more and to open up for quarterbacks that are more mobile. The other day watching the Thursday Nighter, to be able to see how well Mariota played because he had that room to scramble and there wasn't really predictability with Oakland or with Vegas's offense. It was crazy that some guy who was a backup and people thought was going to be a designated wide receiver or never going to get a chance was able to thrive against a Chargers defense that has been quite good this year, minus some of the lapses that they've had at the end of the game. So that opening up of the offense is truly enjoyable to watch because people say, I've had friends say to me, the CFL is boring because, they need a 4th down, or I saw a score at halftime, a Hamilton Ottawa game was like 11-4. Like, how could you have that score? I'm like, have you seen NFL games finish 6-3, 7-3, 3-0? So don't necessarily just put all the blame on the CFL because, they don't have all the, what some people would say are some of the crazy highlights, because the CFL has some crazy highlights of their own. And even to transition then into your role with having been an analyst for the CFL and TSN, working alongside guys like Rod Black and Chris Cuthbert, you've been able to see up close some of the craziest plays that our generation has witnessed. So in your role as an analyst, when did that opportunity arise? And was it something that you thought was going to be feasible for a long-term career? Because you mentioned wanting to go to teachers college and then you got an opportunity. How did that come up?
Yeah, it's been a funny road. And I look at the career that I have had in broadcasting. And I think if you talk to probably anybody that I went to high school with, they never would have imagined that I would be talking on national television, because I was always kind of pegged as a quiet, shy guy in high school. I other than around my friends, my closest friends, I didn't necessarily say a lot, didn't joke around a lot. And, so it's interesting, I guess, that I have ended up making a living talking. But in terms of the path for me, as I was getting to the end of my career, so again, 2002 was my last year. So I guess it would have been 2001. Grey Cup was in Montreal. That was my first year in Hamilton. I had gone there after spending most of my career in Calgary. And in Hamilton, we ended up losing to Winnipeg that year in the East Final. So after the East Final, I was at home. Grey Cup was in Montreal. So it's about, from me in Mississauga, Ontario, it's about a 4.5 hour drive. And so with a bunch of buddies from university, we decided, let's go to Montreal for Grey Cup week to watch the game. A bunch of my buddies from Calgary were playing in the game, guys I had played with for a long time, and I wanted to go and support those guys and so on. And so we went to the game and enjoyed a couple of nights of Grey Cup week as fans, which was certainly enjoyable. After the game, we were out in a bar with some members of the media and so on, and this group of guys that I had played with at Western. Well, one of the media guys that was there was Elliot Friedman, who most fans will know from his work on Hockey Night in Canada. And Elliot had actually been the sports editor of our school paper when I was playing at Western. And so the group of guys that I was with, he knew us all. So Elliot ended up hanging out with us after the game, and he and I got into a conversation about the game. And he said to me at the end of the conversation, he was working for the Score television network at that point as their lead reporter, and said to me after the game, if if you're not playing next year, or if you guys aren't in the playoffs, you should come and work for us at the Score as our playoff analyst. Well, sure enough, I ended up playing one more year, and it was not a fun year in Hamilton. We finished 7-11 and just missed the playoffs. And so, looking to recoup some of the playoff bonus money that I was going to be missing out on, I put in a call to Elliot and got hooked up with the folks at the Score. And so 2002, I went for the 3 weeks of the playoffs, and a couple times a week went and did some studio work with them as their analyst during the playoffs, and reprised that role again when I was retired the next year, 2003, but went back and did the same gig for them again during CFL playoffs. And that evolved into a job with the Score, where I was their CFL analyst. I was doing these segments called The Score on CFL, where I kind of talked about different things about the league, kind of whatever I wanted to talk about. And that also accompanied being the analyst on their Canadian university broadcasts, their U Sports broadcasts. They used to do nationally broadcast OUA games. At that time, we did a game of the week. So that was my first foray into the booth was during that time. Eventually we also added doing a weekly Canadian Football League talk show and so on. And so my role there just grew. And then 2008, when TSN took over exclusive broadcasting rights to the CFL, I was hired by TSN and have been there since.
So it's interesting how, the Score has kind of helped people with really picking it up in terms of the opportunities to talk about Canadian football or to work in Canadian football, because now that it's just Sportsnet 360, there were a lot of great people that many sports fans out there would know now, like Tim McAuliffe and Cicero and
oh, sorry, I'm losing you again.
Okay. Yeah. So you mentioned starting out at the Score and how that opportunity grew, and eventually when TSN acquired the exclusive rights in 2008, that you were able to then pivot to working for them, and that it's usually not just a straight shot all the way to the top to work for a place like TSN. And so the Score has had a lot of great figures that have gone on to now work for Sportsnet, because 360 is what used to be the Score, and TSN has acquired some people that used to work for the Score. Sid Cicero, Tim McAuliffe, Christian Jack, James Starman, the whole crew. There was a lot of great people, and I'm missing some names right now. Like, yourself was there. You worked with Tim calling CIS games, is what I guess it would have been called at the time. So was it strange then now that you had the opportunity to do it full time, and when you look back on it, do you think that it worked out for the best in the end, considering you'd been so prepared to be a teacher, and then life kind of threw a curveball and you went a different path, but you still stayed in football. So I'm sure it's been very enjoyable. Yeah,
it certainly has been. And, one of the interesting things with the Score is the way that the timing worked out was I was actually in teachers college when I started working at the Score, and was teaching high school as well, halftime during the time I was there. So, I had days where I would be, I would teach a couple of classes, and then the way my schedule worked out teaching was sometimes my prep period would fall right after lunch. So it would be like this double long period. I had days where during that double long period, I was Zooming from suburban Mississauga to the Score studios in downtown Toronto and going and recording segments for shows, or, times during my prep period when I was on conference calls with U Sports coaches, preparing for game broadcasts that weekend and things like that. So it was an interesting juggling act at the start, kind of combining the two careers. But the Score provided me a great opportunity, and was, basically come up with a schedule that worked around my teaching commitments, and initially around my teacher's college commitments. So, that was something for me that worked out very well. And as you said, for a number of people, obviously the chance to kind of get some experience, develop our skills, learn our craft at the Score. Winnipeg's own Sarah Orleski was one of my co-workers at the Score, and we actually both moved to TSN in the same year in 2008. And The other little tidbit for you, I guess, would be the last game that I worked for the Score was actually the 2007 Vanier Cup. And I think you know what team won that.
I do absolutely know that the Manitoba Bisons and the Bombers almost did the double dip, but unfortunately for James Johnson and Ryan Dinwiddie, that was not to be. But it's so crazy how one thing leads to another in the world of sports media. Like Sarah Lesky, and she's from Winnipeg. All these people that were local talents, right? Like they started from the ground up, and now we're doing nationally syndicated shows and broadcasting and sideline reporting, all sorts of great things. And then the jump from the Score to TSN with some of the names that you got to work with, working with another legendary Winnipegger and Rod Black, and then having worked alongside Chris Cuthbert and even just in our conversation today, I always think back to your calls on some of the crazy plays that I've watched, like the Ryan Smith catch, shoving the football right in his hip, and what that must have been like. Yeah, the Velcro. It was a Velcro, almost like watching that. So, what have been the most enjoyable parts about now working with TSN and covering the CFL? Because it's a league that has given you so much, with having won 2 great cups with 2 great quarterbacks, met so many amazing people, been to so many teams, and we're still able to just enjoy a well-rounded career. How enjoyable is it now to be able to just live in the neutrality of enjoying the game without having to worry about rivalries or, button heads with guys, or really just, doing what fullbacks do, right? Be big and strong and powerful.
Yeah. It's, it has been enjoyable. I have joked a lot over the last many years that, one of these days I'm going to have to get a real job, because it doesn't feel like that, and this is advice that I give to people all the time is, find something that you enjoy doing and kind of find a way to make it a career, and you'll never feel like you have to work for a living. You enjoy every day that you do. For me, I even look at stuff in the off season. As a fan of sports, one of the things that I love most is the draft. I love the process by which teams are built, by which teams are put together, kind of management philosophies and things like that. And so, doing the research, doing the prep work for the draft is something that I absolutely love. I genuinely enjoy it. It doesn't feel like a job. And so I've been very, very, very fortunate in that way. And, in terms of the time at TSN in particular, I'm thankful for especially the guys that I get to work with on a weekly basis that are kind of our crew that travel together, that work together regularly, that, it is very much our work family. People see Rod Black and I, of course, on TV all the time, but, don't really know that, we have, a producer and a director and ISO directors and stats guys that are usually the same guys that are with us through the season as well. And that there's a closeness and a bond, and I have a great appreciation for those guys and the level of enjoyment that they bring to going to work for me.
And it's interesting you mentioned that, because the other day when I was watching the Thursday Nighter, they were talking about the whole crew. Joe Buck was listing him and Troy and Aaron Andrews and Christina, and also Mike Pereira is a part of the broadcast, because they have like the rules analysts in the NFL. And so it is just more than the person that's standing next to you or the person that's sitting beside you in the booth, because there's so much that goes into the production. And that's why I found it's interesting when I've met people that are the man or the woman behind the video or behind the television, having made connections with people who run social media accounts with different teams, organizations. It's like, wow, you're kind of working behind the scenes, or a bit of I guess they're unsung heroes in a way, because you don't see their face and you don't hear their voice, but they are an equal part of making an amazing production and making sure that you guys have everything you need to be able to produce an amazing show and broadcast the game and make it super enjoyable for the fans. So in work that you've done as an analyst, what are some of the greatest games that you've had the opportunity to work at and to be able to analyze, and how did it feel looking back to say that, wow, I was a part of that game and I was analyzing this as it happened while fans were probably losing their minds?
Yeah, it's funny to think looking back, because it's not always necessarily the best games for me, at least, that that are the things that I remember, or the, sort of the great comeback or things like that. But it's almost at times can be moments and things like that. For example, I think back to especially 2008, that the first game that I worked for TSN was Hamilton playing against Montreal. And, looking back, that was Mark Trestman's first game as a Canadian Football League coach. And so in preparing for that game, that was the first time that I met Mark Trestman. And, I remember being very impressed with his level of preparation and his humility as a guy who had been around the National Football League and had been around big time NCAA football and so on. The level of respect that he had for the Canadian Football League. That's something that has always stuck with me from my first meeting with him. I look at a guy like Darian Durant, who went on to become a huge star in the CFL. I remember doing a game, Vancouver against Saskatchewan, also that 2008 season. And Marcus Crandall was Saskatchewan's starting quarterback and got injured. And the feeling was that Giles was there to be the number 2 guy, and Darian Durant was supposed to be the number 3 guy. But the coach at the time for Saskatchewan decided that Darian Durant was a better fit to go in this situation, because he was a little more calm, a little more composed. And so Darian Durant went into the game, and that was sort of the beginning for Darian Durant going on to become a great Canadian Football League quarterback. And, he was kind of this unknown who had been around on the practice roster without seeing the field for a couple of years. And all of a sudden, is on the scene. And so being there for what was his first game. So, again, I guess it's not even so much necessarily the actual games that are the things that stand out to me, but when you look back at them and things that are almost historic moments or milestone moments for certain players or coaches or whatever it is in the Canadian Football League. Those are some of the things that really stick out for me.
I didn't actually know that about Durant. I knew that he played for Saskatchewan, that his start was around the late 2000s, because, people remember the 2009 Grey Cup, the 13th man, but I didn't actually know the prelude to that was him being a third string guy behind Stephen Giles, who had went to Winnipeg the year after in 2010. I remember that. I remember Giles playing for Winnipeg then. And those moments can be very interesting. Meeting with coaches, getting to know them. Mark Trestman, a guy who, from a story I'd been told by a former player of his, Brian Ridgway, who had coached me in Vancouver Island. He talked about, he's like, Coach Trestman would be very even tempered. Be like, okay, guys, we're going to be doing this in this amount of time. And it's going to take 236 minutes and we're going to get it all done. And that's it. And it was just like super prepared and meticulous, but you can see the results speak for themselves in terms of his preparation, in terms of the success he did have with Montreal and being able to go back to the NFL, because you're right. He was such a prepared and well-respected coach at that time, but he paid his respects back to the CFL by ensuring that he didn't take it lightly because, now we're in Canada, or now the competition is this or that. No, he still treated it, because it is professional football, like it should have been. And you can see in the success that he had with Montreal that, again, it showed in the wins that they had, the Grey Cups, the consistency. People talk about being 15-3 and how that can be daunting when you think about the pressure to win the Grey Cup, with the Stampeders in 2016 having not achieved that feat. But in 2009, the Alouettes were on the ropes despite being the 15-3 heavyweight favorites going into that game against the Riders. Now, mind you, they still pulled it out, and that resilience that Trestman must have injected at least somewhat into their team at halftime, going to the fourth quarter down 16. And that speaks to his character. And that speaks to the history and the context that matters within how successful these coaches are, how these players' careers come to grow and come to be, because it's so easy to just show up and, wow, Darian Durant's great, but do you know where he came from? Or this player is amazing. Or having watched, let's say, Andrew Harris in his first year in 2009, or 2010, did you really know where it was going to go? But then when you see that evolution, I think that can be more impactful sometimes than maybe just one crazy play, like you had said. So it's interesting to talk about that concept, because there are many games, I think, that we let overshadow the longevity of a person's career, right? Like, I remember the first Grey Cup that I ever watched and remembered was 2009, 13th man. Who were all involved in that Grey Cup, right? Saskatchewan being, the losing team, and Paul Lapalisse being a part of the coaching staff, and a devastating loss. But then what happens 4 years later in the Grey Cup at home, winning, all these players that had the feeling of losing and letting it sting inside them, motivated them to find that success and overcome and triumph, this in spite of the fact that their team had been so good and gotten so close, but weren't able to complete it. So that gradual evolution of success, I think, is a great point you bring up, and it is super important to understand in the fabric of the league and why certain games mean so much, because there's so much that led up to it,
Yeah, no, there's no question about that. I mean, it takes me on a different road and a different thought, just thinking about some of the conversations over the years. For us, part of the preparation for games is we do what's called our sit down interviews. So sometimes when you see the kind of the cutaway interviews, or you get clips with players during games, usually we've done those the day before games. And so it's kind of our crew of a handful of people, typically producer and play-by-play guy and the analyst, and a cameraman in a room with the players and coaches will come in one at a time. And it's funny sometimes, some of the direction that conversations will take, whether on camera or off camera, or even just impressions of players from the first time meeting them. Like, again, another one of those guys that I think of in terms of kind of a milestone. I remember the first time that Mike Riley was starting a game in the league with the BC Lions.
Yeah.
And the Mike Riley that fans have come to know over the years as one of the faces of this league. I can tell you, from the first time I ever met Mike Riley, he has been the exact same guy. And one of those guys where, you have times in doing interviews, and you've probably experienced the same thing already yourself, where some people you talk to and you feel like they're maybe giving cliched answers or canned answers, or they're giving you what they think you want them to say.
Yeah.
And there are other guys who just immediately come across as very genuine and very real. And Mike Riley for me is one of those that stands out, that, you sort of have a conversation, some of it on camera, some of it off camera, some of it is quite honestly like just casual conversation and people getting to know each other. And Mike is one where I can say he walked out of the room, and all of us in the room kind of turn and look at each other and go, what a great guy. Like, what a genuine guy. And there have been a number of others over the years, but Mike for me is an example of a guy who was, again, a backup quarterback that not a lot of people knew, that has gone on to become this star, and kind of what you see on TV is as this guy that his teammates would go through a brick wall for. Like, that's very genuine Mike Riley.
And it's interesting you mentioned him specifically, because I remember from the first time that I started watching the CFL, like 2009, it was the Grey Cup. And then I started following the Bombers more closely. And despite them struggling, I still remember watching and remembering certain players who maybe weren't that big, but it was in 2011, I think, or 2012, when Mike Riley was the backup or the third string on BC. And I was like, and I could be totally wrong on this, or I could be misremembering, but I think it was Rob Black who was calling that game. And they were talking about him being the emergency kicker or something like that in warmups, because they were talking about Paul McCallum, like, he was starting to get up there, and Mike Riley was practicing kicking. I was like, what? I'm like, third string quarterback practicing kicking? That's so weird. And then all of a sudden, as soon as he left to take over in Edmonton, you're like, wow, like, this guy can really do it. And this is crazy to see that someone that was once a third string, they could just be some random Yahoo that holds a clipboard for a few years and then you never see him again. But his progression from that time that he spent in BC to then returning to BC is one of the, you mentioned, we're talking about the longevity of success. That is one of the best stories that I've seen of someone being able to circle back to a place where they started, and his amazing relationship with Travis Lulay, which, to be honest, is one of the strongest bonds I've seen between two quarterbacks in recent years in the CFL. It's so fascinating to see how much of a genuine guy that he has been and still is, in spite of the difficult situations he's been in, having won the Grey Cup for Edmonton for their first time in 10 years since one of the greatest Grey Cups that we've ever seen in 2005 against the Owls. That was in Vancouver. It was an amazing feat for Edmonton. It was really great to see all the storylines that lined up for their franchise and winning that one. And even though the team in BC, while he's been there, has struggled, he's still been so resilient and such a tough warrior for their team at quarterback, because they have struggled on the offensive line and they haven't been able to click as an offense as much as they like, but he's still in there, still taking shots, still firing a bunch of dimes to Brian Burnham and to so many amazing guys that their receiving core is loaded with, especially in a tough situation like BC has experienced over the last few years. But that, even like Bo Levi Mitchell, like I remember being in grade 10 and watching the Grey Cup and him going into the game at the end. And now, mind you, people would say, oh, well, it's just the end and Toronto's letting up and it's all good. But the way he played and how crisp he seemed, I was like, wow, like when this guy gets his chance to start in the league, he's going to be really good. Because Kevin Glenn was that ultimate journeyman who was he was in place of a great Calgary team, but maybe wasn't at the height of his elite skill that he had once experienced, like when he was younger with Winnipeg. And seeing this progression in the league shows that there is a lot of promise in the development that coaches provide for players. And it's not just, we're just going to keep recycling through first round picks and first overall picks till we get our guy, because that's not really the case in the CFL with very few Canadian quarterbacks ever being taken. So in terms of watching the longevity in terms of related to success of these players and related to some of the best stories that you've seen outside of Mike Riley, what are some of the other great names that you've seen really make progression in the league and make a statement on who they are as a player?
Yeah, I mean, Bo Levi Mitchell is another one, perfect example. And, as a Winnipegger, you may remember, I mean, that was another game where we had the opportunity to do a guy's first start, where Bo was the third string guy. He was this young guy in Calgary, and they had injuries at quarterback. And so everybody knew that he was going to be pretty good. He was one of those guys, but hadn't played. And, I think he ended up being offensive player of the week that week, his first start in Winnipeg, where he kind of went out and lit him up over 300 yards and a few touchdown passes. And the legend of Bo Levi Mitchell has just grown from there. So, I mean, he's certainly one of those guys. Andrew Harris, a Winnipeg native, you mentioned his history going back to joining the BC Lions as a junior player. And so, I had kind of been told a little bit about Andrew Harris as this junior player who was practicing with the Lions and who, they felt was amazing and was going to be a good CFL player, and they needed to try to find a way to get this guy on the field. They experimented with him as a kick returner. They experimented with him as a receiver, because everybody recognized how good a player Andrew Harris was. And ultimately, it was demonstrated that he should just be the guy at his natural position of running back, that he was as good as any American player out there. And, and to watch his career and the way that it has gone has been as amazing as any. So yeah, there have been plenty of them over the years for sure.
And with the success that Andrew Harris has had in coming back to Winnipeg, that's another story that really shows the full cycle of success in this league, and almost like a LeBron James-esque promise to his hometown to bring a title back to Winnipeg. And having been a Blue Bomber fan for many years and having seen them win the Grey Cup finally for the first time in my entire life, which is wild to think, shows his tenacity and his value to the team in Winnipeg. And I know that analytics people will get super caught up and crazy with running backs and how they're very interchangeable, but there is that intangible factor about Andrew Harris and what he brings to Winnipeg, with how important he is for leadership. You think about obviously some of the X factors that came in, Willie Jefferson. You think about Zach Collaros coming in the right place, right time, the importance of Jackson Jeffcoat on the D line, the strength of the O line and Stanley Bryant, but having Andrew Harris be kind of the centerpiece of that team and be one of the main storylines around Winnipeg seems to almost make them an indestructible force once they had slayed the dragon, so to speak, against the Stamps in the West semifinal this last year. To be quite honest, that has to be the craziest game I've ever seen in my entire life watching the CFL, because I had never, and this is a little bit of a fact of the day, but so since 2001, the Bombers, and I'm sure that you probably even actually maybe knew this, but like the Bombers have won only a few games in Calgary. They won in 2014 in the season's end, and I believe it was also 2017 they won in Calgary. But those games you could say were kind of meaningless because one, they're already out of the playoffs. And number two, they'd already secured the playoff position. So since 2001, the Bombers had never won a meaningful game in McMahon Stadium. And that's a long, long, long time. So for them to have gone in and beat Calgary the way they did, which you could argue that was Boleva Mitchell's worst game of his career, not a knock against him. That just goes to show how amazing he is. And for them to have done it in such convincing fashion was, to me, one of the most remarkable things that I've ever seen in terms of just an absolute stunner. There's so many storylines like that in the league with teams that haven't won in a certain stadium in X number of years, but Winnipeg's win in Calgary was probably the most shocking I've ever seen in my life.
Well, and not just the outcome of the game, but obviously, I mean, the Zach Collaros story at the end of the 2019 season is, I think one of the great, I don't even want to call it a comeback, because I feel like that's almost a disrespect to Zach. But I mean, in a way, a guy that, a lot of people had given up on, right? That Zach Collaros was this injury risk or liability that you couldn't take a chance on. But, I mean, Zach proved that he remains one of the elite quarterbacks in the Canadian Football League, given the opportunity to be on the field and play. And I thought that Paul LaPolice did a terrific job of putting Zach in a position to be successful and do his thing and go to work in a very short time, right? You're not talking about a guy who has had an off season or even a training camp to learn an offensive system. This is a guy joining a team at the end of the season and having to pick it up in a hurry before being thrown on the field. And, again, like I have often said in the Canadian Football League, you cannot win a Grey Cup without having MOP caliber performance from your quarterback through the season. And Zach very much performed at that level. And it was considering that it was a season largely lost due to injury for him. An absolutely amazing performance and a great story for a great guy. Again, I keep going back to this, but I mean, Zach is another one I remember meeting before he made his first start as a Toronto Argonaut. And, is a guy who has always been an absolute pleasure to deal with. And his competitiveness is something that's evident anytime you talk to Zach. And I think that that's something that certainly showed in the Bombers playoff run.
And you talk about learning a playbook on short notice. It almost seemed that Paul LaPolice should be given, an extra special award for offensive coordinator of the year or something along those lines, because to get your quarterback in tune with an offense that is not Mickey Mouse to run by any means, and for you to do it on such short notice and to drop everything and ensure that he can run the offense that on a team that was hoping to be a contender earlier in the year, and for him to pull out brilliant performance after brilliant performance. And we're not talking, you don't have to throw 3 touchdowns and 450 yards, but the game against Saskatchewan, I was fortunate enough to have been there with a friend, and watching that game in real life, you could see just fearlessness in his style of play. They didn't run the ball till I think the 6th or 7th play that game. And the deep shot they took right away to Dembski that was caught, but then it called back for offside. And then they went back again and attacked on Darvin Adams' side on the left sideline. That showed to me that he was there to play. And even though he took a shot after that play, he still got up and he still soldiered on despite many of the hits, or not illegal hits, but some of the hits and bangs that he would have taken during that game. And even during the Grey Cup, didn't get sacked at all, was able to dump it off, was able to to put himself in position to not get hurt and also to allow the team to succeed, it's super impressive. And so seeing those storylines and seeing guys that have that professional rapport and are competitive find success is amazing. And in all the three guys we listed, or four, and Andrew Harris, Bo Levi Mitchell, Mike Riley, and Zach Laros, they all are a part of super meaningful Grey Cup wins for all their franchises, which is not which is not a surprise at this point because they've done so well.
Yeah. And, I mean, simply put, I would say that, you don't win without having great people. I mean, everyone will talk all the time about great players, but having great people is an important part of success. And those are certainly guys who fit the mold.
Absolutely. Now, Duane, we're getting towards the end of our time here today. So I want to ask you another question to wrap up our episode. And so with having been around the CFL for so many years and so many players you've worked alongside, media personalities and everything, it's so difficult to even think of just one thing that would stick out for you. But in terms of the work that you did starting out in media, what is the craziest game that you were a part of while you were calling CIS football?
This, oddly enough, is actually an easy one for me. And, it was a game in which, I probably the quote that people would remember from the game is I even referred to it as it happened as the best game ever. And it was the 2011 Vanier Cup. Mighty Laval Rougeaur playing against McMaster University. McMaster looking for their first Vanier Cup, and Laval, a team that it's not an exaggeration to suggest that Laval basically wins the Vanier Cup every other year. Just a complete juggernaut that has, Glenn Constantin, their head coach, has done a phenomenal job. And I think as a guy who is responsible with what he's done at Laval, has raised the level of Canadian university football across the board. But this is a game where Laval comes in as the favorite, as a heavy favorite. And McMaster goes out, and I don't even remember exactly the score, but I think it was like 28-0 McMaster at halftime. Like McMaster with their quarterback, Kyle Quinlan, who is a guy who should have played in the Canadian Football League. McMaster was just on fire, absolutely unstoppable in the first half. And if they're playing anybody other than Laval, this game would have been over at halftime, except they're playing Laval. So in the second half, it's all Laval. And so Laval roars back and scores all the points in the second half and ties the game. And so the game then ends up going into double overtime. Eventually, Tyler Krapinja ends up hitting the game winner, but it was just nuts. Rod Black and I were calling the game, and it was a week we were doing the Vanier Cup game. Chris Cuthbert and Glenn Suter were going to be doing the Grey Cup game 2 days later on the Sunday. It was a Friday night Vanier Cup, and at one point in the booth, Rod and I looked at each other, and it's almost like the competition among broadcasters is sort of who gets the better game, right? Like you always want to call a good game and have an exciting game to work. And at one point during the game, Rod and I looked at each other and kind of said, there's no way those guys get a better game than this. And it was absolutely phenomenal. It was, to me, kind of a magnificent showpiece for Canadian university football. Just a great duel to watch. Like a very, very unique game. And again, like any different combination of teams and players and so on. And, this game could have been one-sided either way at any point, but it was just, two great champions going toe to toe.
And I like that you mentioned this game because that is the first ever CIS game I can ever remember watching, because and like the talks have been muttering around the CFL circles of combining the Grey Cup and the Vanier Cup and trying to, parlay to the Canadian Bowl into it too with junior. That to me, I thought that the Vanier Cup and the Grey Cup were always a match made in heaven for that reason. Watching that amazing game And to me, I didn't really know anything about university football at the time. I just knew, oh, this team kind of looks like my high school because they were maroon, and the other team is really good, and apparently they've won a bunch. So who knows? But the way that the game was played and the call you guys made and how back and forth it went, right down to the wire, with Krapina having missed the game-winning field goal in regulation and then going to double overtime and getting the second chance, and having watched there was I think a TSN or some video production they made about that being the best game ever, and it's still on YouTube. And then the next day, while the Grey Cup maybe wasn't as exciting, but it went down right to the wire, just like the game before. And to have that festival of Canadian football exist within that one weekend alone, I thought, man, I can't wait to see the Vanier Cup be held the day before the Grey Cup next year. But then, if I'm not mistaken, it was held in Toronto the next year too, right? Like the Vanier Cup?
Yeah, it was, because it ended up being a rematch. Same two teams ended up playing, but Laval won.
Yeah. So then again, we had Grey Cup and Vanier Cup in the same weekend, but then it just never revived. It always seemed like it was just kind of a coincidence. And so that match made in heaven, I thought, was one of the best displays of Canadian university football I'd ever seen, because of the reasoning with how exciting the game was, it being paired up with the Grey Cup, and everything considered in. That should be a tradition going forward that I think the CFL and U Sports could take an amazing advantage of, because that really would help bolster the image of U Sports in the country. And it would also help with boosting people to go to the Grey Cup, knowing that they're going to get two great football games.
Yeah, and it's something, as you alluded to, has been talked about, making that the norm, and it's been talked about many times over the years of trying to do that with the games. I would say it doesn't necessarily work in every city in terms of availability of hotels and facilities and some of the things like that you need in order to make it happen. But I think as often as they can make it happen, as something of a U Sports guy, it's something that I didn't fully buy into initially, because I sort of felt like, knowing what Grey Cup week is like, where the argument, one of the arguments in favor of doing it has always been that you have all of the football media in the country at one place at one time, that it would generate more attention for the Vanier Cup. And, especially having worked on the media side and covering Grey Cups, but having the spot in my heart that I do for Canadian university football, my concern was that the Vanier Cup would risk getting lost in the shuffle, that it would be just another event during Grey Cup week, that it would, people don't, all the sports writers that are in town don't write articles about the Grey Cup parade, for example, and things like that. And so recognizing that, those people are there to cover the Grey Cup, are they really going to give the Vanier Cup due? Is it going to be treated as an important event? But when you look at the way it's gone with some of the games where the two have been packaged together, going back 2007 was another one where they were in the same place, same weekend. I think that there are a lot of positives that can come out of it, and with the mentality that has been suggested of having it be all part of a week-long festival of Canadian football, the best that there is, I think is a positive.
And there obviously are counter arguments, like you mentioned, with the not wanting it to get lost in the wash. And you're right. You don't want it to follow that fate, but still at least trying to find a way for there to be a union between the two, so that there can be that promotion of Canadian football in terms of pro and amateur, I think would be a good thing that they can do. Like you mentioned, as many times as they can would be amazing. But obviously, with how limited the Vanier Cup has been to happening in the West, that does present a bit of a crossroads for the Grey Cup lining up with it perfectly. Because Manitoba has never hosted the Vanier Cup. Saskatoon's hosted only a few times. So it would have to be something they would work out with the stadiums and the venues and practices and whatnot. But if they can make it happen, I think that would be the more the merrier as time goes on. But with that, Duane, I want to thank you so much for being on today's episode. It was a super super, super amazing talk about Canadian football, about being in the media, and especially about understanding the depth with the storylines that follow players and coaches who have had amazing, amazing opportunities to work in the NFL, to be those genuine guys. It's been super, super fun. I'm so glad that you're able to be on today.
Absolutely my pleasure. And I hope we have the chance to do it again.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again, everyone, so much for listening to today's episode with CFL on TSN analyst, Duane Forde.